Today we are joined by Phil Lord. Phil is an assistant professor at Lakehead University's Bora-Laskin Faculty of Law. He was when appointed at age 24 and remains the youngest law professor in Canada. Phil previously served as an instructor at Carleton University's Department of Law and a law clerk at the Federal Court of Canada. Phil graduated from the McGill Faculty of Law with degrees in Civil and Common Law, on the Dean's Honors List and with the highest standing in Property Law and Constitutional Law. He subsequently pursued an LLM as a Bombardier Scholar. Phil is called to the bar in New York, Massachusetts, and Quebec. He is a member of the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators and holds 3 financial services designations. Phil has authored over 20 academic articles, most peer-reviewed. His research focuses on public law, principally employment and taxation law, behavioral economics, and new religious movements. Over the past 2 years, Phil has given interviews to or briefed journalists from 5 media outlets. Thank you for joining us, and welcome, Phil.
Hi, thanks for attending my presentation. My name is Phil. I am a law professor at the Bora-Laskin Faculty of Law at Lakehead University in Thunder Bay, Ontario. And my presentation is on the impact of the heterogeneity of research on new religious movements, particularly Scientology, how that's developed over the past several years, and how that might affect the path forward. As you'll see, I have this very cool title, which I came up with when I went to a conference. So the anti-cult wars is a label that was used to describe certain activism relating to new religious movements, and cult watchers is actually something I was called on a panel at the CESNUR annual conference, which is something that will, an organization that we'll talk about a bit more in this presentation. So unbeknownst to me, they put me on a panel that had cult watchers in it. And so I thought the opposition between the two was pretty cool, and trying to see where we might get, right, between the people who are vehemently in favor of new religious movements and people who are vehemently opposed to them, and perhaps trying to find both some common ground and a more kind of neutral or intermediate stance in research, perhaps going forward. So this project is really related to an article I just published in the ICSA journal, so the IJCAM, I think, which you can find on the internet. I was going to put the link on there, but it's long. It's pretty much easier to Google me, I think. But it's titled "Echoes of Responsibility," and it discusses the importance of scholarly responsibility to research, and especially research regarding new religious movements. And it argues in favor of a more kind of nuanced stance as to disagreement with certain researchers, and particularly in trying to draw the distinction between research that we disagree with and research that we think is fundamentally flawed, generally for methodological reasons. So I start out with my prior research in that article, which is concerned generally the importance of academic research to religions. So religions benefit from certain very important and fundamental benefits under the law, generally in 2 separate groups. The first one has to do with constitutional protections. These generally attach inherently, which means you don't have to be a good religion, you don't have to meet additional criteria. As soon as you show that your religion, they attach, right? Government doesn't get to say there's some other reason why you should not benefit from these exemptions. So these are constitutional protections, and on the other end, there are certain statutory protections, generally in the context of taxation, for example, which do not attach inherently. So where the government will not have to give it to you and will be able to say, right, if the religion is not good, then we'll choose to add additional criteria that don't relate to just being a religion, and will bar the religion from being able to get tax exemption. In all of these processes, so whether in court cases or legal processes that attribute religious status pursuant to the Constitution or pursuant to certain statutes, Both of these kind of groups of processes afford great importance to the role of experts because they're thought to be independent, because the tests require the opinion of people who are familiar with what constitutes a religion or what a specific religion believes in. As a result of that, religions have understood that they need experts to be on their side. And we've seen that very acutely, and I described that in a number of my research projects, including some that I've presented in earlier years at earlier conferences. Um, Especially Scientology has been particularly aware of that and been able to use that kind of strategically. So to try to intervene, not just in trying to find experts that agree with it, but trying to have more experts in the first place, which is to say to catalyze kind of the production of academic research, especially in recent years. So I argue that there's been a change in kind of strategy on that. So before 2015 or so, Scientology didn't care about that. It just thought it would attack experts that it disagrees with, and that would be sufficient because if they're not credible, no one's going to listen to them anyway, right? That was Scientology's position. 2015 or so, we see a pretty significant change in strategy where Scientology says, no, we want to favor the production of academic research, both directly and indirectly, and trying to cultivate a group of scholars that agree with it, that think that it's good religion, it's generally persecuted as a result of that, should be subject to very few restrictions by the government and should get access to the benefits that we mentioned, right, constitutionally or by virtue of a statute. And we've seen that, right, that break in the historical homogeneity, right, fancy word there, of Scientology research, just to say most people used to be opposed to Scientology. But as a result of that change of strategy, which has been pretty successful, we've seen the emergence of more pro-Scientology scholars. And that's with the emergence of an organization called CESNUR. That's the argument I make, at least, which has a journal, which is ostensibly peer-reviewed, that produces a lot of research that's favorable to Scientology. And it's really changed, right, the market for research on Scientology. It's kind of flooded us with articles that we often don't have the time to respond to, and that we think might be methodologically flawed for a number of reasons. And that's the main criticism that both I and other scholars have made of the people at CESNUR, that there's some methodological issues, right? And we think that we don't disagree with their stance necessarily. It's fine for people to believe whatever they want, right? It's fine for people to be in favor of Scientology, to think that it's persecuted. But we think that oftentimes with that research, there's methodological problems. We think it's flawed, right? We think these people don't meet the kind of minimal standards that apply to academic research. And as a result of that, it's worthy of being criticized as to its value, not just the substance of what it says, right? Whether the substance of what it says should be accepted as a legitimate and complete part of academic discourse. Their criticism of us, as far as I understand it, and I've actually spent about 2 years thinking about that, so I like to think I understand it pretty well, is basically 2 or 3 things. The first one is that somehow we lack sophistication, that we're obsessed with trying to look at what a religion does, what a new religion does. So obsessed at trying to see the bad things that Scientology does, right? Disconnecting family, people not seeing their kids, certain forms of physical punishment, which have been admitted within Scientology, and that somehow that's kind of childish, right? That we're focusing on these things, which might be true, right? They don't think they are, but might be true. But all the while, we don't even focus on what the religion actually is about. We don't read the Scientology doctrine. We don't talk about it. And that's more sophisticated, right? And that the research on more traditional religion does that, more religions does that it focuses on the praxis, the theology, right? How people practice the religion and what the religion says, as opposed to what certain people within the religion do, bad things, or what the religion itself does. Again, generally bad things. And there's been a correlative criticism, of our reliance on the testimonies of former members. And they've developed a pretty kind of sophisticated theory, which we think is completely wrong, as to why former members are never credible sources to be used in academic research. And that poses a pretty big problem because oftentimes they're the only source that we have, right? So taking Scientology again as the example, Scientology has a policy that basically says if they decide that you're against them, no one will talk to you, right? So I've had Scientologists collaborate with me in my kind of early years, at least to some kind of very minimal extent. And then as soon as they found something that I said they didn't like, which frankly was not really even that critical, um, I, 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 I like to think I'm pretty balanced. I'm certainly not the most critical scholar of them, right? Then they just said I'm a person to be reckoned with, and therefore they shouldn't talk to me. So certainly there's a problem if then there's an academic theory that says we cannot rely on former members, because that says we cannot rely on anyone. If we want sources to tell us what's going on, right, that are not books or documents, then we're kind of screwed, because they're saying we can't rely on former members and we have no current members to rely on. And their theory goes something like these former members are generally people who have been kicked out, which by the way, we think is wrong, right? But people who've been kicked out, therefore very mad, and need to rationalize their poor experience by demonizing their religion. And so invariably, in trying to make sense of what just happened, and also in trying to justify their poor behavior, which got them kicked out, they will come up with bad things about the religion that generally will be wrong, simply for the purpose of explaining to themselves their experience and kind of rationalizing it. Our rebuttal of that, right, is basically what I said. So we think that organizational behavior is important to some extent. I'll get back to that. But we also have criticism that can be made of us in that we have adopted a pretty similar theory, right? We haven't said it in the same way, but we've kind of said that current members are not reliable. Because current members, oftentimes, again, taking the example of Scientology, don't really get to say what they think, right? Because same policy applies. If they say something negative, then they'll be kicked out, which means they'll only tell you positive stuff. And oftentimes they'll tell you stuff that is demonstrably false, often with kind of statistics regarding membership of Scientology or certain organizations or branches of Scientology. We see just factual statements that are demonstrably incorrect. That being said, right, we can kind of be criticized for basically doing the same thing, for saying something analogous, which is current members should never be used as a source in academic research. And I think that that makes us vulnerable to criticism. And either way, it's not really a good thing, right? Whichever position it is, certainly one we like, one we don't, right? One advantages us, the other one does not. But I think whichever one it is, it's detrimental generally to the vibrance and sophistication of academic research generally regarding Scientology. Specifically, there's also rebuttal, which I alluded to earlier, as to the relevance of organizational behavior. So we don't think that we actually lack sophistication and only focus on the bad things that certain people or the organization itself does. In other words, we do look at the doctrine, right? I've got lots of books in my library, which I read on Scientology doctrine. I engage with that in my research. That being said, I also engage with the criticism of the organizational behavior. And I think a sophisticated argument that I've made in response that I think is actually correct is that for the specific context of Scientology, it is necessary to look at organizational behavior, because organizational behavior flows from religious doctrine. It's not just there's a religion that says something and then there's people who do bad things, because they always will, or the religion itself that sometimes does bad things, because that's human nature. In the case of Scientology, oftentimes the bad things are mandated by the very nature of religious doctrine, by the beliefs themselves. So the doctrine says people have to do certain things, which we then deem to be abusive. And to the extent that that's the case, I think we can't get around, right, to actually looking at organizational behavior, because we cannot understand the beliefs without understanding the behavior that is mandated or that flows from these religious beliefs. So I think the path forward generally is to calm down a little bit. It's in my article, which I mentioned earlier, and to try to find common ground. I think the criticism that we make and the criticism that we receive that generalizes sources as unreliable is dangerous, because it just means that we can't get into a dialogue, right? We just dismiss things out of hand. And same thing with our tendency to try to turn claims that are substantive into methodological claims. And I argue that in the long term, we have to be a lot more careful about distinguishing these two things, right? Distinguishing scholars that just say things that we think are wrong, that we disagree with, and scholars that say them in a way that lacks sophistication, that is methodologically flawed, and therefore should be dismissed. Because it's important, right, to have certain standards in academic research. But it's just as important to have research we engage with, to not just dismiss everything we disagree with as methodologically flawed, because then we can engage with it, right? We can't cite it, we can't talk about it, and that's not good for the advancement of human knowledge generally. We need that kind of a dialogue between opposing positions within the academic context that with research that meets at a certain minimal level of methodological soundness. And finally, I conclude in the paper, as I do now, that we actually have some things in common. And the main thing that I think is highly positive about Scientology research goes back to that criticism of members and former members. Because regardless of which way it is, it says something about us, and that is that we talk to members or former members. We are very good, and I think in a way that's pretty unique among various fields of academic research generally, in getting into our research the opinion of the people that really matter, the opinion of the people who practice the religion or who suffer from the consequences of having practiced a religion, and making our research both clear and useful to them, right, relevant to them, and also responsive to their needs and their preoccupations, which I think is a fundamental aim that all scholars should have, and that lots of other disciplines should think about. And both pro-Scientology, to put it that way, and contra-Scientology scholars have been very good at, right, taking a portion of these members or former members and really having research that is responsive to their needs, that engages with their needs, and that they themselves can understand and engage with. So that's it. Thank you very much, and I look forward to taking your questions.